Bill Clinton's rise is very interesting. His uncle Raymond, as you just mentioned, had apparent organized crime connections, but also political connections within Arkansas that allowed him sort of to get a leg up. He's a Rhodes Scholar. He studies at Oxford. Rhodes Scholars, the Rhodes Scholarship and Oxford in general have a lot of intersections with intelligence. And of course, when Bill Clinton later becomes president, his administration is stuffed with other Rhodes Scholars just like him. But he's allegedly recruited by the CIA to spy on people while he's at Oxford in relation to, I think, the anti-war movement or something along those lines. So there's a lot of these interests apparent very early on in the Bill Clinton story. Then, of course, with Hillary Clinton, you have her being involved in the Rhodes Law Firm, which is a long-standing law firm in Little Rock, Arkansas. But, during the period where she got involved, became very much involved with the fortunes of a man named Jackson Stevens, who is a very, very powerful businessman who I guess most of his business interests are based in Arkansas, but he is much involved in a lot of stuff much bigger than Arkansas, and ended up not just bankrolling a lot of the Clintons' political careers, but also Bush Sr., for example, and he had a lot of involvement with a lot of this intelligence-related stuff I talk about in the book through his different companies, and a lot of his ability to use his companies for those purposes were directly facilitated by the Rhodes Law Firm, where you have Hillary Clinton. And in addition to her, you have other people that have prominent roles in the early Clinton administration, Webster Hubbell and Vince Foster. Webster Hubbell is forced, has to leave, of course, under a cloud of scandal, and Vince Foster dies relatively early on in the Clinton administration under very, as I note in the book, suspect circumstances. And it's not the only suspect death of a top Clinton official during the Clinton presidency.
Can you share a little bit more about Fostergate? Because it was sort of illustrative of what we're seeing and hearing since then, this idea of there was a fundraiser. And one of the most surprising things I read was that Hillary Clinton allegedly was selling high-level nuclear code secrets to Israelis. And then there was a payoff. Vince Foster's wife got like a $286,000 deposit mysteriously in her account, and he was going to meet with the president, and suddenly he's dead.
Now more than ever, is it important to protect your data online? Think about public Wi-Fi. You're at a cafe or in an airport, or even at the gym, and you're connecting to free Wi-Fi without a second thought. That free Wi-Fi is often a hacker's playground. With just a few clicks, someone can intercept your connection, steal your information, and even track your browsing habits. That's where Private Internet Access, or PIA, comes in. With Private Internet Access, you can safeguard all your online activities with military-grade encryption, protecting you from hackers, governments, and even your internet provider. Plus, they have a strict no-logs policy, which means they don't track or store any of your browsing history, so your privacy stays private. One click and you're protected. No complicated setup required. That's why we use Private Internet Access. Get 83% off and 4 months free using our link for a limited time. You can click the link in the description to try it out today.
So this is a very complex story, so people that want the details on it, I would refer you to the book, because it's all out there. So basically you have Jeffrey Epstein from 1987, possibly 1985, with some of this stuff. He's in Leslie Wexner's inner circle by the time he's affiliated with the Clintons at the beginning of their administration. He's Leslie Wexner's money manager and has almost total control over Leslie Wexner's business entities and finances through a very far-reaching power of attorney. But he also created a Ponzi scheme around that same time with Stephen Hoffenberg that collapses spectacularly in 1993. Towers Financial, one of the biggest Ponzi schemes in U.S. history. His name is dropped from the case, and he's associated at that same time with this fundraiser at the Clinton White House that's not necessarily being run by the DNC or Bill Clinton. It's being run by the White House Historical Association and the First Lady's office, meaning Hillary Clinton. And
to redecorate, right?
Allegedly to redecorate. So I might actually just refer to my book for part of this, if you don't mind, because I think it gives a better idea of what we're dealing with here.
I found it to be fascinating. I was
Yeah, I mean,
Foster-
it's a really crazy story. So the New York Times reported on Vince Foster's quote unquote suicide note. So first off, police, when they searched Foster's office after his death and his body was discovered, found nothing in his briefcase. His briefcase is empty. Then somehow 36 hours later, the First Lady's office says that this suicide note appeared and it's Foster's. It's sometimes also referred to as Foster's quote unquote resignation letter. And what's odd about it is the New York Times wrote the following about it, and that's the quote I'm looking for. Yeah. So she's responsible. So basically, Hillary Clinton is the main person behind the 30-hour delay in releasing Foster's alleged suicide note to authorities, and photographing the note was forbidden. It was exempt from Freedom of Information Act requests. A copy was somehow obtained by a man named James Davidson, who arranged for 3 handwriting experts to examine the note. They judged it to be a forgery. Anyway, but Hillary Clinton's personal involvement is important because the note states that, quote, the usher's office plotted to have excessive costs incurred taking advantage of Khaki Hockersmith and HRC Hillary Rodham Clinton. So according to the New York Times, interpreting that line of the letter, it says, Hillary Rodham, this part of the note refers to, quote, Hillary Rodham Clinton's redecoration plans for the White House, and cryptically charged that the usher's office, which oversees the renovations, was using those plans against Clinton and her decorator, Khaki Hockersmith. And then it goes on to say, quote, Mr. Foster alluded to cost overruns in schemes associated with the redecorating, which he did not describe, but feared would embarrass the president and Mrs. Clinton. So this is the fundraiser that Ponzi schemer Jeffrey Epstein, name drop from the case, is affiliated with redecorating this. It ends up in Vince Foster's suicide note. It's the only mention of Hillary Clinton in the whole suicide note. And the New York Times says it was because of schemes associated with this, and it would have been Vince Foster's job as chief counsel to determine if there was anything suspect about the finances of that fundraiser.
So what would they be raising funds for, and what was this tied to the potentially nuclear codes to the Israelis?
Right. So that's a part of something else that's, well, it's related, right? So it's not necessarily tied to the fundraiser. In the same mix where you have Foster's death, you have this Fostergate story. So the top investigative reporter at Forbes in 1995 was a man named James Norman. James Norman wrote this very explosive piece that he called Fostergate. And basically the allegations of Fostergate, based on, he had a lot of different evidence backing his claims and basically was able to confirm a lot of it, corroborate a lot of it, but he did use some anonymous intelligence sources. But again, it's a very sensitive story. So basically, the allegation is that Vince Foster had a Swiss bank account. Hillary Clinton shared that bank account with him to some extent, and that basically Hillary Clinton was selling nuclear codes and other sensitive information, most of which obtained from the NSA, to Israel, and that Israel was then sending money to the Swiss bank account of Vince Foster, and that he and Hillary Clinton were essentially partaking in that. And allegedly, the Israelis would then sell that information on to other countries like China, our ostensible adversaries, right? So, there's a lot more detail than that in the book of why this is a probable incident, and it's very alarming. Because basically you have a grave undermining of national security happening there. But it's consistent with some other things I do talk about in the book. For example, Israeli espionage targeting the U.S. in the 1980s through either Jonathan Pollard or the PROMIS software scandal is very significant, involves Robert Maxwell, for example. Yes. Was very focused on U.S. nuclear institutions. Then you have this fundraiser where you have Epstein and Robert Maxwell's daughter, Ghislaine Maxwell, tied up with, Hillary Clinton and Vince Foster. They're involved with this weird fundraiser that's obviously quite suspect. And then Vince Foster dies, and it's, according to James Norman, apparently connected to Israel and nuclear, theft of sensitive nuclear secrets. The PROMIS software was basically a major global coup. And it was a global coup in two senses. So like you said, the PROMIS software was really good at doing two things: tracking people and tracking money. The tracking people side, I would argue, is really the focus of the Israeli version, and the tracking of money was more of the focus of the CIA, with collaboration of Systematics, a Jackson Stevens company, tied up with Vince Foster. And going back to Vince Foster, the way he was able to obtain those NSA documents is because of his role at Systematics. Systematics, the Jackson Stevens company. Systematics was a contractor for the NSA. But essentially, the PROMIS software scandal, there's these two sides of it. The US version created with the CIA and the Israeli version. The Israeli version infinitely more successful in terms of sales than the CIA version. And the main salesman for the Israeli version was Robert Maxwell, who was already at the time an asset of Israeli intelligence, but became much more actively involved after he was directly recruited by a man named Rafi Eitan, a well-known Israeli spy master, also the handler for Jonathan Pollard, and a huge amount of espionage targeting the United States. And in doing so, Robert Maxwell sold PROMIS mostly to security agencies around the world. And it was throughout in Latin America, in the United States, in Eastern Europe, and beyond. It's focusing mainly on security agencies. In the case of the US, though, it was mainly sold to nuclear laboratories or, federal laboratories like Sandia Labs and Los Alamos. And the only way he was able to succeed in selling that software, because people at those labs tried to contact the NSA and raise the alarm that something was seriously wrong here, and they were shut down, and the FBI investigation shut down. And the FBI today still will not release their documents about Robert Maxwell and PROMIS. That's insane. It's been a really long time. You think they could release it if there's nothing there, but there obviously is. One of the reasons, anyway, that he was allowed to access that is because Henry Kissinger told him exactly who to pay off and recruit for Israeli intelligence. So Henry Kissinger is a dirty, rotten traitor to the United States of America. And let us hope that 2023 is the year he finally dies, because it's intolerable being on the same planet as him. Anyway, sorry about that.
Yeah, Bitcoiners often talk about him. He engineered the petrodollar. So
he engineered a lot of things.
Yeah.
He's a pretty awful human being, and may he go soon. But anyway, Kissinger told him to pay off a guy named John Towers, who was the head of the Senate Armed Services Committee. He was a senator from Texas, and he was due to leave office. And and Maxwell, at the recommendation of Kissinger, puts Towers on the Mossad payroll and uses him to open the doors to Los Alamos. What has been set up in the United States now, and during the same period of time in the 1980s, you had the enterprise of Iran-Contra fame within the national U.S. security state use PROMIS to create a database called MainCore, which was a database of U.S. perceived dissidents. Because you could be on there, not necessarily because you're I want to overthrow the government, but because you went to a protest once, or you didn't pay your taxes on time, and all other sorts of reasons like that. And they plan to invoke it in the event of what they called a national emergency. But of course, that's a very vaguely defined term. And in their own documents, that national emergency could have been mass non-violent mobilization against a U.S. invasion of another country.
Well, I want to come back to that, because isn't MainCore, that's essentially what Snowden was really frustrated about and eventually leaked, right? Or was that TIA?
He didn't talk about MainCore, but it's very related to what Snowden did talk about. So the illegal surveillance of Americans after September 11th, 2001, is sucking up all your data. And he's right about that. It is illegal. It is unconstitutional. But what he didn't say, and maybe he didn't know, is that all that information is you're profiled based on that today.
Right.
So if we let our souls atrophy because we're not doing anything that, have been fulfilling to human souls for thousands of years, what does that ultimately mean? It's interesting in that same Schmidt-Kissinger book, they basically say that AI taking over will lead to one of two consequences. One of them is that the peasants rise up and overthrow the elite. That's one scenario, and probably not the scenario that Schmidt and Kissinger want. And then the second scenario is that AI spawns the creation of a new religion. So out of those two allegedly inevitable scenarios per those people, obviously I think it's quite clear, if you're familiar with the backgrounds of Schmidt and Kissinger, the outcome they want is that it creates a new religion. So we atrophy our souls and creativity in that spark that makes us human and outsource it to AI, and then it becomes a new religion. I mean, it's pretty crazy. It makes me think of the Greek myth of Narcissus, where he falls in love with his reflection. And I think it's that would definitely be a way that gets us to that post-human future, and it's something I think people should resist because, there's something important about humanity. There's obviously a reason that there's sort of this push to sort of snuff that out, and I think ultimately it leads to a world where humans are just easily controlled and essentially either harvested for data, harvested for energy, harvested for something, and not creators anymore. And it's up to anybody if they choose what path they choose to go down, whether they're going to go down the path of someone who creates and can manifest and who can actively do things and actively make decisions and have preferences and do these things that ultimately are part of what defines humans, right? Or if they're going to go down the path of, I'm going to be lazy essentially and let these machines do everything for me. But then you become either not necessarily even part of the machine. You end up, instead of the machine serving you, you end up serving the machine. And I think that's how we get to digital slavery quite fast if too many people take that path. So I think there's a lot of things people can do to, resist these agendas, but I think that is a very easy and very important thing for people to do and consider. But I think, again, it's people need to have red lines about this type of stuff and just be aware of the risks. And if there's skills you have that are important to you, do your best to, maintain them. If you want to use AI occasionally because you're in a pinch to generate something, that's not going to screw you over long term necessarily. But if you become reliant on it and that's all you use, and then after a year or something, you probably will see a difference. And, their vision, the Kissinger-Smith vision, is that this will happen on a society level and that people will become, as they say, cognitively diminished. That does not sound positive. That does not sound good. So if you choose to use AI, I would urge you to make sure that you're not cognitively diminishing yourself, whatever that means for you. AI will they say, invariably lead to a division of society. Essentially, they don't use this term, but I will use it, into classes of haves and have-nots. But the way they define it is a little different. Sort of this more elite tier would be the people that determine AI's objective function, that program and develop AI and understand what AI does to people. And then the lower class presumably would be much larger, and that is the class that AI will act upon, but people will lose the ability to know what AI is doing to them. And they argue that this process of people losing the ability to know what AI is doing to them will happen because of this phenomena they refer to as cognitive diminishment, which is sort of this idea, and that's pretty easy to verify. If you stop doing mental math and use a calculator all the time, it gets harder and harder and harder to do mental math. And the same is true for really like any skill that you don't practice. So they argue that because of the convenience of AI and how it's been creeping into our lives, and I think we've seen this a lot since the advent of generative AI, it will become harder and harder and harder and eventually impossible for people to do certain things, including make decisions for themselves, because the AI will tell you where to go. It will tell you what music to listen to. It will tell you what clothes to buy. And essentially, that's their vision. People will eventually lose the ability to make those decisions for themselves or even develop their own preferences without the assistance of artificial intelligence. And so obviously the way to fight against that is to not outsource all of your decision-making and skills to that. And unfortunately, I think during it, as we've seen with the rise of generative AI, people are creating less. People are outsourcing their creativity to AI, have AI make art for me, have AI write things for me. And eventually that leads to a world where in a generation, people don't know how to create art or create music or write without AI. And what does that ultimately mean for humanity? Then essentially we do end up in sort of this helpless state where we become dependent on machines to function. But it only happens if we voluntarily give ourselves over to that type of system and decline to use the abilities granted to us by our consciousness and our souls and decide to let machines do it for us and have them become the creators and have us just be, processors for AI? Batteries like the Matrix. I mean, I don't know, but I'd rather not see that come to fruition. And I think the way to avoid that is very easily within the hands of anybody, regardless of your economic status or what your skills are. Everybody can create something. Maybe you whittle things out of wood. Maybe you make music. Maybe you make art, visual art, or other, woven art. I don't know. There's all sorts of things people do. People have always been creating ever since we've existed as a species. And I think if we surrender that, then the post-human future would be an inevitability. And that's essentially what these people are hoping for. And I think it's important for people to fight against that. And I think when people talk about resisting this agenda, this is something that inherently gets left out of that discussion. And I don't think it should be at all. Because again, I don't think people are really reading what a lot of these architects of AI policy are thinking and saying. People are just willingly using it because it's convenient, it's easy, but without really thinking about long-term consequences. And I'm sure people that have been using generative AI, I don't know, in independent media to generate content for your site, has it gotten harder to write those things after using it for a year? Probably. For those people, I would wager. And that type of phenomena is only going to get worse. And what happens when we can't even develop, we can't even think for ourselves anymore? Because stopping creating, not being able to write, eventually you're not going to be able to think without the help of this algorithm or whatever. And again, as I mentioned earlier, AI is prone to hallucinating, seeing realities that aren't there, and all sorts of things. And how deep could we get dragged into some sort of artificial illusion if we sort of outsource our thinking and our creativity to this type of, entity? It's kind of funny because Schmidt and Kissinger argue that these hallucinated realities, AI seeing realities that humans can't observe, mean that the reality must be real because AI is so much more intelligent than us, so that we should believe whatever it sees that's unobservable. And I don't know, maybe that could be true in some instances, but since there's no way to verify, do we really want to shape society around what could be hallucinations of some, human created machine just because, certain people that are powerful in society have an almost religious-like devotion to artificial intelligence? I don't think that makes any sense. Personally. But ultimately, when you engage in a creative act, what are you filling up or fulfilling, or what muscle, as you put it, are you using? I would argue it's your soul, right? If you just have AI make it, the person that's making it doesn't get the same type of feeling they get if they actually engaged in the act of making art themselves or with another human.
If you enjoyed today's video on Anonymous Official, leave a like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Thanks for watching and sticking with us.